Good morning, everybody. Sorry for the gimpy leg. I fell on the ice in my hurry to get to Key West last week. Not really, but I am thrilled to be here, and I feel it's like my failing that I've never been to Key West before. I found out that I'm going to talk about an author who's particularly meaningful to me and also to Key West, actually, which is Elizabeth Bishop. She's not a writer from the Caribbean or in the Caribbean, but I think Key West had a function in her life that allies her with the Caribbean in many ways. Apparently, I learned, not apparently, but I learned while I was here that this seminar was devoted to Elizabeth Bishop in 1993. And I was talking to Arlo and his mother, and I asked him, I said, well, were you here for that? And he said, yes, as a baby. So I guess it's time, it's good, enough time has passed to talk a little bit more about Elizabeth Bishop in Key West. And this is my first PowerPoint, which Ian very expertly helped me put together. As I was coming in from the airport, I was with Teju Cole, and we were talking about Hemingway in Key West. And he said he was making a kind of disparaging comment about Hemingway and said, well, it's great to be in this place where one of the greatest writers of the 20th century, Elizabeth Bishop, spent a lot of time. And she did. She was here. She came here beginning of 1937, when Ernest Hemingway was nearing the end of his time here. She came here. I called my talk North and South, and North and South was the title of her first book, and it was also the, how would you say, the bipolarity in which her life and her experience existed. And I think that for her, South, which was first experienced as Florida, represented freedom, license, escape, relaxation of demands that she felt very intensely, internally, I think. Here she is in Key West, not feeling those demands. As someone, a very nice person who drove me around, since I can't walk, said, well, she didn't have she loved Key West, but she didn't have, her time here wasn't all roses, and that's true, because she was struggling with a lot of issues. She was still in her 20s when she came here. She was born in 1911, and she came here first with her friend Louise Crane. Louise was her classmate at Vassar. She was a very wealthy woman. Her family owned the Crane Paper Company, which made the paper on which the US dollar bill is made. And they first went to the Key Waden fishing camp in Naples, and then someone told them they should come to Key West to fish. And Louise was a very good fisherman, and I think Elizabeth was also a fisherman, as we know from her poem, The Fish, which was written here or about Florida in any case. So they came here, and they eventually bought a house together at 624 White Street. And if you go there, as many of us did, there's a little plaque on the gateway that testifies to their presence here. But I thought I'd begin by reading Elizabeth's poem, Florida, which is one of the earliest poems in her book, North and South, her first book. The state with the prettiest name, the state that floats in brackish water, held together by mangrove roots that bear while living oysters in clusters, and when dead, strew white swamps with skeletons, dotted as if bombarded with great hummocks like ancient cannonballs sprouting grass. The state full of long S-shaped birds, blue and white, and unseen hysterical birds who rush up the scale every time in a tantrum. Tanagers embarrassed by their flashiness, and pelicans whose delight it is to clown, who coast for fun on the strong tidal currents in and out among the mangrove islands, and stand on the sandbars, drying their damp gold wings on sunlit evenings. Enormous turtles, helpless and mild, die and leave their barnacled shells on the beaches and their large white skulls with round eye sockets, twice the size of a man's. The palm trees clatter in the stiff breeze like the bills of the pelicans. The tropical rain comes down to freshen the tide-loop strings of fading shells. Job's tear, the Chinese alphabet, the scarce Junonia, party-colored pectins and ladies' ears arranged as on a gray rag of rotted calico, the buried Indian princess's skirt. With these, the monotonous, endless, sagging coastline is delicately ornamented. 30 or more buzzards are drifting down, down, down over something they have spotted in the swamp, in circles like stirred-up flakes of sediment sinking through water. Smoke from wood fires filters fine blue solvents. On stumps and dead trees, the charring is like black velvet. The mosquitoes go hunting to the tune of their ferocious obligatos. After dark, the fireflies map the heavens in the marsh until the moon rises. Cold white, not bright, the moonlight is coarse-meshed, and the careless, corrupt state is all black specks, too far apart, and ugly whites, the poorest postcard of itself. After dark, the pools seem to have slipped away, the alligator, who has 5 distinct calls: friendliness, love, mating, war, and a warning, whimpers and speaks in the throat of the Indian princess. Now, many aspects of Elizabeth Bishop's greatness are in this poem: her observational skill, her sense of humor, her beautiful language. But one little detail I think is worth noting, which is that when she was at Keewaydin, she became friends with a couple, the Russells, Red Russell and his wife Charlotte. And Red was a great outdoorsman. He took her to meet the famous Ross Allen, who wrestled alligators and taught her about the 5 calls of the alligator. So she was doing research all the time, no matter what she was doing. She told Marion Moore, who was her poetic mother, that Florida was her favorite state because it's so wild, or in its settled parts, so dilapidated that it seems about to become wild again. I wonder what she'd think of it now. They came here really because one of the reasons they came is that Elizabeth had been involved with a man, I can't remember his name right now, who was in love with her. And eventually he killed himself, and he left a note that said, "Go to hell, Elizabeth." And she was so guilt-stricken and guilt-ridden by this that I think Louise took her down here to help her recover. She was also always guilty about this. But But Elizabeth Bishop was not the marrying kind. Louise was one of her lovers, and they lived together, as I said, in Key West. They also traveled together. In 1937, they went on a trip to Europe with Margaret Miller, another friend of theirs from Vassar. This is a picture of Louise in bed, probably on their trip, by Elizabeth. Elizabeth Bishop was a very talented amateur painter, and she did a lot of pictures here, which I'll show you some of them. But this is Margaret, not Margaret, this is Louise. And there's Red Russell and his wife with Margaret and Elizabeth. They became very good friends, and they visited her in North Carolina at one point. This is the house on White Street, painted by a painter named Gregorio Valdez, who was a resident of Key West. Elizabeth found some paintings of his on Duval Street in a kind of dusty storefront, and looked him up and befriended him and commissioned him to paint the house with every little detail involved. And in fact, there's a tree, one of the trees was not on the property at the time he painted it, so she planted one so it would match the tree, the picture. And she had a number of other pictures of his, and she wrote about him after he died. She wrote an encomium for him that was published in the Partisan Review. He actually had a show in New York of some of his pictures before his death. Now, 624 White Street there seems to be floating in a very open area, and I think it was quite open until the Navy started to build up Key West, and across the street they put some barracks, which she was not happy about. That's a picture of how the house looked in her day, and she was ecstatic about it. She wrote to Marion Moore, "The house is beautiful inside and out, so cool and pure. I have most of my books here at last, and stacks of old papers and notebooks to destroy. In the backyard, we have a lime tree loaded with limes, which simplifies drink making. Also, banana trees, of avocados, a mango, a sour sop," she says in italics, "and a grapevine which bears one bunch of very rye-looking grapes." In another notebook, she wrote about their cat Baby on the lawn. And the first time she and Louise had the philosopher John Dewey and his daughter, who lived here, to dinner, she wrote, "Baby playing on the lawn, looking very small and bewildered. He lives in the shade of the lime tree, blinking at the white and yellow butterflies and occasionally pouncing at a cricket or a lizard. If I call his name from an upstairs window, he looks all around, but never quite high enough." She was very taken with this place. She said, "There's something inherent about the soil here, so shallow, and digging in it with a trowel, I found a bottleneck, several bones, an old celluloid hairpin, lots of rocks, plaster, etc." She loved the rain here. She thought for a long time of calling her second book after North and South Bone Key, because Bone Key, Cayo de Hueso, is an old name for Key West, and apparently the bones go back to the fact that it was a graveyard for the Indians originally, or some say that anyway. She wrote a lot of poems here. A lot of them were unfinished, and that I think that's part of, she was having a lot of difficulty, which she had all her life, finishing things. One of her other problems was that she had become a very serious alcoholic, and that was an issue that complicated her life here and elsewhere all her life, really. Here she is in the yard. There she is, the second from the left. And the man in the striped shirt is the painter Lloyd Frankenberg. Next to him is Lauren McIver. They were painters who were very close friends of hers. And on the right is Hannah Almeida, who was her housekeeper here and became a kind of mother to Elizabeth. She wrote, "It's the middle of the beautiful month of June. I'm eating a green melon with a silver spoon. It's afternoon. The walls of the house are white. The sun comes through the shutters the way I like, and the housekeeper whom I love more than precious jewels." She was very, very devoted to her, and they were really close. Her observations of Key West were very, very beautiful and memorable, and many of them are in this book that we published called Edgar Allan Poe and the Jukebox, Uncollected Poems, Drafts, and Fragments, which has many of the poems that she wrote here and a lot of quotations from her journals, which we will also soon be publishing. There's too much to read here, so I'm going to skip over a few things. But she said the air after the rain is as delicious as sherbet or a drink with grains of ice floating in it. Now, Key West in those days, as Arlo was saying, was quite different from the way it is now. And Elizabeth was a very curious person. She and some of her other friends used to go down to an old whorehouse called the Square Roof. Does anyone know about the Square Roof? The Square Roof was there are two opinions about it. One person said Elizabeth Louise and some others thought it was fun to go down there. They used to have a few drinks and sit around. I once went with some friends and Elizabeth, and I was never more uncomfortable in my life. It was slumming. There were black prostitutes sitting around, and there was somebody playing the piano. Pauline Hemingway and all that crowd used to go there. There was also a place called Pina's Rose Garden. Well, that was one view of it. Another was provided by James Laughlin. James Laughlin was a great publisher, one of the greatest of mid-century. He wanted to publish Elizabeth Bishop, but he tried to pin her down too much, and it didn't work. But he was also Tennessee Williams' publisher, so he came down here to visit Tennessee Williams. But here's what he had to say about going to the Square Roof. And by the way, there's Mrs. Almeida. There's Elizabeth on the roof of the Square Roof. Tennessee had walked me around the town a bit. I was struck by an old wooden building that had a square roof. The place was indeed known as the Square Roof. It was a brothel. It turned out that Elizabeth and Louise had researched the Square Roof in the line of literary duty. "I have a friend there," she told us. "Would you like to meet her? We could pay a call." Not meaning a professional call, but a social one. Elizabeth arranged the invitation to tea. Tennessee suggested we doll up a bit to show how we were chums, not customers. It was one of the few times I saw him in a necktie. 10 was small, but he could look quite handsome when he took off his shades. They were his shield from the world. He was shy, but what a smile when he liked someone. The madam of the square roof was elderly. She must have been very pretty once. She had somewhat elegant manners. She enjoyed making polite conversation. I wanted to ask her if Hemingway had ever been a patron when he lived in Key West, but decided I'd better not. A confidential matter. The young ladies were of various dimensions, including one who was quite round. A special taste? They were wearing their church dresses. Their guardian informed us that some were Methodists and some Baptists, and that they attended Sunday services regularly. They were not talkative, though Elizabeth and Louise tried to draw them out, but it was evident from their demeanor that they were glad to see us, etc., etc. Suddenly, one of the girls inquired if we would like to see her room. A moment's silence, but Elizabeth said that indeed we would. We all traipsed upstairs. I found the girl's room touching and sweet. The bedspread with a high carved back could have come out of any bourgeois house in the Bordeaux, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So that is what I mean when I say that there was a kind of freedom, license, ability to be yourself that Elizabeth Bishop experienced here. She was curious, she knew how to have fun, and she was part of a circle of women who were rule breakers. How would I say? Discreet rule breakers. Someone else also wrote that Elizabeth and Louise had mint julep parties. They would crush mint leaves, soak them in the bourbon overnight, and pour this mixture over chopped ice, which sounds pretty good to me. I'm going to read one wonderful poem. There were a lot of great poems from this period that weren't published in her, or a number of them that weren't published in her lifetime for various reasons. This one is called Pleasure Seas. In the walled-off swimming pool, by the way, if you've been to the Hemingway house and you've seen the swimming pool, you know all the stories about the expense of the swimming pool and the size of it. She swam there in the days that Pauline had the house after Hemingway left. In the walled-off swimming pool, the water is perfectly flat. The pink Syrah bathers are dipping themselves in and out through a pane of bluish glass. The cloud reflections pass huge amoeba motions directly through the beds of bathing caps, white, lavender, and blue. If the sky turns gray, the water turns opaque, pistachio green and mermaid milk. But out among the keys where the water goes its own way, the shallow pleasure seas drift this way and that, mingling currents and tides. In most of the colors that swarm around the sides of soap bubbles, poisonous and fabulous, and the keys float lightly like rolls of green dust from an airplane, the water's heavy sheet of glass above a bas-relief. Clay, yellow coral, and purple dulcet, and long-leaning submerged green grass. Across it a wide shadow pulses. The water is a burning glass turned to the sun that blues and cools as the afternoon wears on. And liquidly floats weeds, surrounds fish, supports a violently red bellboy whose neon color vibrates over it, whose bells vibrate through it. It glitters rhythmically to shock after shock of electricity. The sea is a delight. The sea means room. It's a dance floor, a well-ventilated ballroom. From the swimming pool or from the deck of a ship, pleasures strike off, humming, and skip over the tinsel surface. A grief floats off, spreading out like thin oil. Spreading out thin like oil. and love sets out determinedly in a straight line, one of his burning ideas in mind, keeping his eyes on the bright horizon, but shatters immediately, suffers refraction, and comes back in shoals of distraction. Happy the people in the swimming pool and on the yacht, happy the man in the airplane, likely as not. And out there where the coral reef is a shelf, the water runs at it, leaps, throws itself lightly, whitening in the air. An acre of cold white spray is there, dancing happily by itself. You can see in that poem the things that are at play in her mind. I'm running out of time, so I'm going to skip ahead and show you some of Elizabeth's pictures that she painted here. You'll recognize some of these buildings. There's one of the poinciana trees that she loved so much. There's the cemetery, which she loved walking by the cemetery. There's the Olivia Church, which I couldn't find. And notice the power lines, which are a big element in her art. Look at the extension cord there. I'd love someone to study what the meaning of all these lines are in her work. Now here is Pauline and Marjorie Stevens, who was Elizabeth's lover after she broke up with Louise. And they had a little shop together. I don't know where, in the Caroline House. Some of you probably know where that is. I couldn't find it. And this, I'm going to read you, is one of her wonderful love poems that was never published in her life. It was written for Marjorie Stevens. It's marvelous to wake up together at the same minute, marvelous to hear the rain begin suddenly all over the roof, to feel the air clear as if electricity had passed through it from a black mesh of wires in the sky. All over the roof the rain hisses, and below the light falling of kisses. An electrical storm is coming or moving away. It is the prickling air that wakes us up. If lightning struck the house now, it would run from the 4 blue china balls on top, down the roof, and down the rods all around us. And we imagine dreamily how the whole house, caught in a bird cage of lightning, would be quite delightful rather than frightening. And from the same simplified point of view of night and lying flat on one's back, all things might change equally easily, since always, to warn us, there must be these black electrical wires dangling. Without surprise, the world might change to something quite different as the air changes, or the lightning comes without our blinking, change as our kisses are changing without our thinking. That was Marjorie Stevens. Marjorie Stevens was kind of a nurse to Elizabeth, tried to keep her from drinking. Eventually, their relationship foundered. But she kept coming back. She would go north to New York to have her literary life. But she always, for many years, until she went to Brazil, really, she kept coming back to Key West. And I would say Key West was the first place where she felt free in many ways. It was a kind of rehearsal for Brazil, where she spent the longest period of her life. But in 1948, I'm going to read one more poem, which is also about Key West, and it's called The Bite, and it's about Garrison Bite. It's called The Bite on My Birthday. At low tide, like this, how sheer the water is, white, crumbling ribs of marl protrude and glare, and the boats are dry, the pilings dry as matches. Absorbing rather than being absorbed, the water in the Bight doesn't wet anything. The color of the gas flame turned as low as possible. One can smell it turning to gas. If one were Baudelaire, one could probably hear it turning to marimba music. The little ochre dredge at work off the end of the dock already plays the dry, perfectly off-beat claves. The birds are outsize. Pelicans crash into this peculiar gas unnecessarily hard, it seems to me, like pickaxes, rarely coming up with anything to show for it, and going off with humorous elbowings. Black and white man-of-war birds soar on impalpable drafts and open their tails like scissors on the curves, or tense them like wishbones till they tremble. The frowsy sponge boats keep coming in with the obliging air of retrievers, bristling with jack straw gaffs and hooks, and decorated with baubles of sponges. There's a fence of chicken wire along the dock, where, glinting like little plowshares, the blue-gray shark tails are hung up to dry for the Chinese restaurant trade. Some of the little white boats are still piled up against each other or lie on their sides, stove in, and not yet salvaged, if they ever will be, from the last bad storm. Like torn open, unanswered letters, the Bight is littered with old correspondences. Click, click goes the dredge, and brings up a dripping jawful of marl. All the untidy activity continues, awful but cheerful. And that's what Elizabeth Bishop had inscribed on her gravestone, awful but cheerful. Thank you.